It's a sad day for these students as they mourn their beautiful classmate Tomie, who was brutally murdered. But when Tomie shows up to class like nothing happened, they start to dread not only the looming shadow of her malevolent spirit, but also the deeper, darker truth it unveils. There's a killer on the loose. Their last victim was the beautiful Tomie. But no matter how much Riko and the rest of the class mourn their friend, she's not coming back. At least that's what they think until Tomie walks into class. At first, no one wants to believe it's her. They were sure she was dead, but here she is, right in front of them. How's that possible? The police found her body cut up into pieces, but Tomie claims she has no idea what's going on. Eventually, she confronts Riko on her way home about how strangely everyone is acting towards her, and when Riko notices the dark path Tomie had led her down during their walk, she runs away. That's when she bumps into Tomie's ex and fellow classmate, Yamamoto, and together they agree that it's time to confess about what really happened to Tomie. Finally, the truth is revealed. Yamamoto caught Tomie cheating on him with her teacher during a field trip, resulting in a confrontation that caused Tomie to fall off a cliff to her death. But because everyone in class hated her, they decided to cover it up instead of calling the police. So, the teacher took all the boys into the woods with her body, where they dismembered her, separated the parts into bags, and distributed them amongst the class, along with the instruction to dump the bags somewhere where it could never be found. Riko threw her piece over a bridge, the very bridge Tomie had taken her down during their walk. When the class catches wind of Riko and Yamamoto's plan to confess, they unite to confront them head on. Lucky for Riko and Yamamoto, Tomie shows up and stops the fight from happening, and serves as a reminder that no matter how hard they try, the truth will always come to light. While Tomie's power lies in her ability to drive those around her to madness, she also embodies a harrowing narrative of gender-based violence, illuminating the possessiveness and entitlement that often accompany such brutality. Ultimately, Tomie serves as a chilling testament to the relentless nature of truth. No matter how desperately they attempt to erase her from existence, she remains, a glaring presence that ensures they never forget the horrors they inflicted. The truth, it seems, will always claw its way to the surface, whether they wish it to or not. Kuriko falls in love with the kid she used to bully as a child, but when he gets the ultimate revenge, she takes her anger out on her own kid. The Bully by Junji Ito is such a messed up story about childhood trauma and how sometimes age does not signify growth. When Kuriko is asked to play with the new kid in town, she does so begrudgingly, and everything is fine at first. Her and the new kid now seem to be getting along, and his mom even drops off some cake to thank her since her son doesn't have a lot of friends. But as time goes on, she grows annoyed with Now, and the more her animosity builds, the more violent she becomes. She's pushing his head down into dirty puddles, she's beating him with sticks, and when she gets paranoid after almost getting caught by his mom, she goes to his home and demands to know if he told on her. He says he hasn't, and that's when she forces Now into a pen with a violent dog. Shortly after, he moves away. And now, years later, as an adult, Kuriko is confessing her guilt to her current boyfriend. Turns out there's more to the lore because Kuriko recently bumped into Now, they've been hanging out, and he confessed that the reason he never left her alone was because he was so in love with her. Even more shocking, he still is. It's why Kuriko is leaving her current boyfriend for Now. Now and Kuriko get married, she gets pregnant, but before the baby is born, Now leaves them and doesn't come back. Turns out this was all a part of his revenge plan, and despite knowing this, Kuriko hopes Now is going to come back. But the more time passes, the more her resentment builds, and suddenly she's seeing just how much her son looks like his dad when he was a kid, and she misses bullying him, and so she begins treating her son the way she treated Now when they were kids. It's why she waits until night to dress up in her old childhood dress and take her son to the park so that she can play with him just like she used to play with his dad. The episode ends before we can see what happens next, but I'm sure she kills her son. Junji Ito's stories usually have some sort of supernatural element, but this one is terrifying because the threat is so real. Not only does the story highlight how bullying and child abuse can affect someone well into their adult lives, but it shows that age does not determine maturity or growth. Some people are stuck in the past. They do not grow out of the people they once were and choose to harbor toxic qualities that developed in their childhood. I also noticed that once Now openly forgave Kuriko, she stopped feeling bad for what she did, and it's almost like she wasn't genuine in her guilt. She didn't feel bad about the abuse she inflicted. She felt bad because she thought the image of herself in someone else's mind was tarnished. She never actually cared that she did the wrong thing. She only cared about how she was perceived by others.
何にもしない。何にもしないわよ。
やっちまおうや。
There's been a murder, and the first thing Kaoru and Tsuyoshi do is try to cover it up. Unfortunately for them, you can't hide from death in Toontown. Kaoru and Tsuyoshi are driving to a remote village in the mountains to visit their friend, Izumi, when they run into a woman standing in the middle of the street. And because she dies before they can get her help, they put her body in the trunk and decide to bury her out in the mountains. But as they're driving through town to get to the mountains, they find out that all the roads are blocked by gravestones. It isn't until they finally meet up with Izumi where they learn the truth about her town. Apparently, people in this town turn into tombstones when they die, and their tombstones erect in the exact place of their death. But if the body is moved or disturbed before it can transform, they remain stuck mid-transformation, unable to rest in peace. It's why those disturbed bodies need to be dumped down a special well. Things take an even darker turn when Izumi and her family become worried about the whereabouts of her little sister since she's been gone all day. It doesn't take long for Kaoru and Tsuyoshi to uncover that the woman they hit is actually Izumi's little sister. And after a search party and an investigation, police uncover her blood in the middle of the road along with paint from the car that must have hit her. But Kaoru and Tsuyoshi still aren't saying shit. They're joining the search party, saying they don't know what's going on even after Izumi finds blood in the back of their car. And because the block is getting hot, they make a run for it. They say, they came at a bad time and that they're going to let Izumi and her family focus on finding her sister. So it's nighttime, they leave Izumi's house and head to the well where they dump the sister's body, which is already stuck in its mid-transformation form. But as they dump it, Tsuyoshi cuts his hand on the body. So they make it back home, and that's when Tsushishi's suffering really begins. Because not only is he having guilt-ridden hallucinations, but the cut on his hand becomes infected, and he ends up dying. And when he dies, he turns into a mid-transformation tube, just like the disturbed bodies in Toontown. As for Izumi and her family, they find her sister's bracelet by the well, and after realizing that her sister had been killed and dumped, the family becomes so depressed that they end their lives in their home, and now their tombstones will remain there forever. This episode raised an ethical dilemma. If you committed a crime and you knew you could get away with it, would you actually turn yourself in? At first, I understood this to be a sad story about grief, deceit, loss, and manipulation. Tsuyoshi was wrong for killing someone, even worse for pretending like he had no idea what was going on. He even joined in on the search party, fully knowing the body everyone was looking for was in the trunk of his car. He spent the entire episode manipulating the narrative, pretending he didn't know the truth, and deceiving the people around him by lying his way out of trouble. Kaoru was no better for being complicit in her brother's actions. And then I started wondering, would you snitch on your sibling? Especially if you knew they could get away with it? I did feel bad that Izumi and her family had to suffer because of the selfish desires of other people. And I guess this episode goes to show just how big of an impact the choices you make have on the people around you. Kazuko's best friend calls her from outside her window, but she's too afraid to open it. Why? Because her best friend is dead, and whoever is on the other side pretending to be her is something far darker. This episode, titled Hanging Balloon, delves into themes of grief and mourning, while also illustrating how rapidly tragedy can transform into a spectacle. Kazuko is hiding from the person speaking to her from outside her window. It's her best friend's voice, but her best friend is dead. So who the f is that? Flashback a month ago, the nation mourns pop idol Terumi Fujino after her body is discovered hanging outside her window. Even though people knew how worried she'd been about her career, they still can't comprehend how she could take her life at the height of her pop idol stardom. Some fans blame her boyfriend Shirashi for putting a lot of pressure on her, but her best friend Kuzuko knows it's not his fault. And she can't explain it, but there's something weird about Terumi's death. Even weirder, people are saying they've seen Terumi's giant head floating in the night sky. Doctors explain this mass delusion as a trauma response brought on by the public's collective grief over Terumi's death, but when Shirashi confides in Kazuko that he's seen the giant head with his own eyes, he convinces her to come and see it for herself. Eventually, she does see it, and it's terrifying, and even worse, it's not alone. Alongside it is a giant head with Shirashi's face with a noose hanging from its neck, which it uses to kill Shirashi in his state of grief. The next day, Kazuko tells her friends what she saw, but they don't believe her until their own giant heads fly down from the sky and begin chasing them roam around town with nooses. They kill 2 of her friends, and when one more is shot down and deflated, her friend deflates along with the head, showing that whatever happens to the heads happens to the person it takes after. And in no time, the entire country is being terrorized by these giant heads. Even Kazuko's own family is picked off one by one by their own heads. Finally, we're back to the present. Kazuko is in her room when she hears her brother's voice. Thinking she's no longer alone and that he must have survived the attack from his giant head, she opens the window only to find that her brother is dead and her own giant head is waiting for her, alongside him. This episode definitely highlights the effects of grief and how it doesn't just impact one person. It spreads, encapsulating the network of people affected, no matter how minuscule the relationship may seem. And we see this a lot in celebrity death and how, despite not actually knowing the person, you can still feel the impact of their loss. One of the main things that stood out to me in this episode was how a tragedy turned into a spectacle. What began as a tragic death of a young woman plagued by societal pressures and unbelievable expectations as an idol in a very domineering and stressful industry turned into the public's fascination with the supernatural. Instead of focusing on the lack of mental health support or how societal pressure forced a girl to take her life, people became fascinated with the tragedy, becoming obsessed with the harrowing details instead of the victims affected, which we often see in things like true crime. When Professor Soya uncovers a baby's skull at a ruined site, he unknowingly unleashes a curse upon his 2 daughters. Had he known that taking the skull would destroy his family, maybe he would have let the body rest in peace. This episode, titled Layers of Fear, features characters who grapple with themes of identity and transformation as they strive to break free from their childlike images. Meanwhile, others remain trapped in the past, forced into a state of regression that ultimately leads to their destruction. When Professor Soya uncovers a baby's skull at a ruined site, he notices the layers of clay encasing it like a tomb. As rain begins to fall, his team rushes to preserve the site. However, Professor Soya decides to take the skull for his own studies. Years later, his family is driving home after celebrating the 13th anniversary of his passing. Narumi, his oldest daughter, is behind the wheel while her mother and younger sister, Ryumi, sit in the back seat. As Narumi drives, she can't help but overhear the frantic conversation unfolding behind her. Ryumi insists that she has grown up and no longer needs to be coddled like a child, yet her mother dismisses this, longing for the days when Ryumi was just 2 years old and always sought her attention. After all, Ryumi's been her favorite child since a television scout discovered her beautiful perfect child at the age of 2. Since then, her mother has poured every resource into ensuring Ryumi's success, and justifies it by saying Narumi is ugly as fuck and can't be fixed. Narumi, shocked by her mother's words, becomes distracted and fails to notice a truck barreling towards them. Even though everyone survives the accident, Ryumi sustains a horrific facial injury that takes half her face. They rush to the hospital, where doctors uncover something strange about Ryumi. Her face is perfectly fine. Turns out she has multiple layers of skin beneath her outer layer, with each layer representing a year of life. The deeper they go, the younger the layers become. While the doctors express a desire to conduct further research, the mother refuses and insists on taking Ryumi home. While waiting for Ryumi to be discharged, Narumi speculates about the connection between Ryumi's condition and the cursed skull their father found before his death. She theorizes that removing it from the site brought a curse upon them, and reveals that her crooked teeth actually consist of multiple rows that extend to the back of her mouth, showing that she has been affected by the curse as well. Back at home, Narumi suggests holding a memorial for the stolen skull in order to get rid of the curse, but all their mother wants to do is dote on Ryumi. Eventually, Ryumi grows frustrated with her mother's incessant coddling and lashes out, blaming her mother for the accident. This confrontation only intensifies their mother's obsession. One night, she hears 2-year-old Ryumi calling from within her sleeping daughter, begging to be let out. Driven by desperation, the mother begins tearing away at Ryumi's skin until she reaches the layer containing her 2-year-old face. Narumi walks in just as her mother starts peeling away the layers of her body, and instead of stopping her, she assists. However, Ryumi's body has grown with her, revealing a grotesque form of adult muscle beneath the layers. Desperate, the moms plan to rebirth Ryumi by tearing away her own layers until she reaches the age she gave birth to her. Unfortunately, the curse didn't affect her and she disfigures herself when she pulls off her face. Years pass and the mother refuses to leave the house. Ryumi's skin does not grow back as it once did, and now Narumi must care for them both. This episode presents a conflict between growth and regression. While Ryumi strives to break free from the childlike image forced upon her, her mom yearns to return to a time when she felt whole. Ultimately, regression prevails when Ryumi's mother attempts to revert her back to a childlike state, a state Ryumi desperately wished to escape, while her mother seeks to relive her happiest moments. Both characters soon realize that it is impossible to relive the past, and the mother's refusal to learn from her past experiences ultimately leads to everyone's downfall. And I think this idea of regression, this inability to accept your past as it is, learn from it and move on, is exactly what this episode is about. At its core, this episode highlights the mother's inability to accept her husband's death and her desperate desire to return to a time when her family was complete. Her unresolved grief creates a destructive path that stifles Ryumi's attempts to move on and grow from their shared pain. It's as if she is constantly peeling away the scabs of a wound. By refusing to allow her wounds to heal properly, the underlying problem remains unresolved. And just like Ryumi's skin, whatever grows over it will never return to its original state.